Here in this video, we'll be going over the absolute basics to refereeing your first basketball game. We'll talk about everything from what you need to wear, as well as what the most common calls you'll be making on the court. First, if you want to see more content about officiating, check out our YouTube channel for a constantly expanding library of videos. First, let's talk about what you need to wear. There are three basic components of a basketball referee's uniform. You have the referee shirt, pants, and the shoes. The shirt is the black and white striped referee jersey. The pants usually look a lot like dress pants, and then the shoes are going to be black athletic shoes. There is only one piece of equipment for the basketball referee, and that is the whistle. Now, if you are not used to blowing a whistle, it is important to know that the first couple of times that you do so, it is not going to sound good. But there are a couple of things that you can do in order to improve the quality of that sound in order to provide more clarity and confidence on the court. First, do not be afraid of the whistle. It does take a little bit of effort to produce a clear, loud sound from a whistle, so don't be afraid to use it and blow hard. Other sports, such as baseball, which we've talked plenty about, rely on your voice in order to communicate, whereas in basketball and in soccer and other sports, the whistle is your voice. So make sure that you're projecting the same amount of confidence and clarity through your whistle as you would if you were using your own voice. So now you've shown up to the court, you're dressed, you've got your whistle, you're ready to go. What exactly needs to happen in order for you to start a game? Well, there are two things that need to happen. One, you need to make sure that your scorekeepers are ready to start the clock. Now remember, your scorekeepers are usually volunteers and oftentimes kids themselves. So make sure that you're giving them the most amount of guidance, or being very clear with instructions with them, as many of them are doing it for the first time or flat out don't know how to use the equipment in front of them. Make sure you're helping them as much as possible, and making sure that the clock is running appropriately throughout the game is going to be one of your responsibilities. Now, to actually start the game, you're going to have a jump ball. You're going to have a jump ball by tossing the ball up between two opposing players at center court. Now, we'll talk more about the positioning for that in just a minute and where you're supposed to go after you do so, but that's how you start the game. One of the other things that should be happening is that the scorekeeper should be setting a possession arrow. The possession arrow helps in two areas. One is if there is a jump ball on the court, and two is in between quarters. Whenever one of those two things happens, a jump ball or the change in quarters, the possession arrow is going to switch sides. And at the start of the game, the team that lost the jump ball is going to have the arrow pointing for them. So that when one of those two things happens, now they have possession of the ball. And then it will alternate for the other team. This is something unique to levels that are college age and below. The NBA does not have a possession arrow, so if you're used to watching a lot of NBA games, it's going to be a totally different rule set. All right, so the scorekeepers are doing their job. They've got the possession arrow. The clock is running appropriately. How do you actually make calls on the basketball court? There are two things that you need in order to make calls. You need to actually make a signal, and then if it's a foul, you also need to report it to the scorekeepers. We're not going to talk about all of the different signals here, but when a foul or violation occurs, you will want to give the signal for the foul or violation, and then if it is a foul, you want to make sure you report to the scorekeepers. The scorekeepers should be documenting fouls throughout the game in order to know if a player fouls out or if a team enters the bonus. Like we talked about before, part of your responsibility as a referee is to make sure that the clock is being managed appropriately. And whenever a foul or violation is called, depending on the rules, sometimes there is a running clock, but most of the time, the clock will need to be stopped. So make sure that the scorekeepers are stopping the clock for a foul or a violation, and then that the clock is starting again once the ball is put back into play. So now let's ask, what exactly are fouls and violations? Well, an easy way to think about them is a violation is simply breaking a rule, but isn't necessarily committed against another player, whereas fouls are violations, but they are committed against the other player or against the other team. As you mentioned earlier, fouls also need to be tracked throughout the game because you could have a player foul out or a team enter the bonus. We're not going to go through all the different fouls and all the different violations, but rather I want to talk about a couple of each that you will encounter almost every single game. It's the most commonly committed fouls and violations in youth basketball. The 5 fouls that you're going to have the most in youth basketball are charging, blocking, pushing, holding, and hitting, or illegal use of hands, technically speaking. So let's talk about each of those. First, for charging and blocking, one concept we do need to talk about is something called established position. Now, this isn't anything used by a rule book, but the rule book does describe what having an established position is. Let's talk about 2 examples. If you have 2 players running down the court, a defensive player and an offensive player, and the defensive player abruptly stops in front of the offensive player and then there's contact and maybe they fall down, that would be considered blocking. The reason is because the defensive player didn't have established position in front of the offensive player. He was moving, abruptly stopped, and now all of a sudden you have 2 players on the ground. That's a blocking foul. However, what if the player was standing at one end of the court, not moving, waiting, and the offensive player just ran into him. That would be a charging foul because the defensive player has established position. You could also have a defensive player lean into the path of the opponent. That would also be considered a blocking foul. Because even though they're not moving their feet, they still don't have established position in front of the offensive player, and they're moving their upper body abruptly in order to get there. Next, let's talk about pushing. Pushing is extending your arms, other than vertically, in a way that hinders your opponent's movement. A player can use their arms in front of their own body or their face, but they can't use them to hinder the movement of another player. But you could also have pushing happen without a player extending their arms at all. For example, if a player were to lean into another player, knocking them to the ground, that would also be pushing. So now let's talk about hitting, or illegal use of hands. While there's a couple of different illegal uses of hands, I'm talking about hitting specifically here because this is what you will have the most often when stealing the ball or on a shot. The only contact that's allowed if you're going to reach in for the ball is you can make incidental contact with the player's hand while the hand is on the ball. If you're making contact with their forearms or their arms or their body or anything that's not the hand touching the ball and not incidentally, that's going to be an illegal use of hands. As I mentioned before, this happens the most often when a player is trying to steal the ball from another player or when a player is shooting and another player is trying to block them. This foul is what leads to the most free throws happening. The last one we'll talk about is holding. Now there's a couple different ways that holding can happen. The first is to inhibit the movement of the opposing player. If you're just grab onto the opposing player, that's clearly a foul. But the second is to act as an aid to start and stop moving. So for example, you can't push off of another player in order to start running down the court, and you can't stop your momentum by grabbing onto another player. As I mentioned before, any fouls that happen during the act of shooting will result in a free throw. If a foul happens and then the team misses the shot, 2 free throws will take place. If a foul happens and the team makes the basket still, you'll have an and one situation, which means that it'll just take 1 free throw and the basket that was made will still count. If you have a foul that's committed on a player that's shooting from beyond the 3-point arc, that will be 3 free throws instead of 2. So now let's talk about violations. Remember, these are rules that are broken but aren't necessarily committed against another player. So they just result in a turnover and they aren't reported to the scorekeeper. The most common ones you'll run into in youth basketball are traveling, double dribbling, 5-second inbound, and kicking. Double dribbling and traveling are both dribbling violations. And double dribbling is when you stop dribbling and then you start dribbling again without shooting or passing. Traveling is when you stop dribbling and then you take more than 1 step. You can have a pivot foot and a foot that you're moving, but you cannot be moving both feet without dribbling the ball. A 5-second inbound means that once a ball goes out of bounds or you have a violation or whatever it is, and the player's in position and the official hands them the basketball, they have 5 seconds to put the ball back into play or else it's going to be a violation and then a turnover. And finally, a kicking violation is when a player intentionally kicks the basketball. If the player accidentally dribbles the ball off of their foot, that's not a kicking violation. But if there's any intent at all to kick the basketball, that's when you would have a kicking violation and then a turnover. So now that we've talked about some of the more common calls that you'll be making, let's talk about positioning. Most of the time for youth basketball, you're going to either have 1 partner or no partner at all. Very rarely do you have 2 partners working a 3-man system in youth basketball. It does happen, especially for championships or maybe even a high school game, but rarely does it happen for 14-year-olds and younger. So first, let's talk about what happens if you're working a game by yourself. When would this happen? Well, this would happen when you're working a very, very low level game. So just kindergarten or 1st grade, you may find yourself in a position where you're working a game by yourself. So where exactly are you supposed to go? It's actually very easy. You're just supposed to move from free throw line to free throw line in the middle of the court, making sure that you're out of the way as much as possible as any play's happening. So do your best to stay out of the way of any passing lanes or running lanes, places where you're going to trip a player or block a pass. But now let's talk about a 2-referee system. When there are 2 referees, there is a lead referee and a trail referee. And they'll move up and down the court together, and the goal is to try to create a box around the players. The reason you do this is because you want to make sure that you have the most coverage of all the players and that you can see all the plays that are happening. The lead referee will stand off of the end line and will be in charge of the key, the sideline that they're on, and also the part of the court that's directly in front of them. Meanwhile, the trail referee is going to be in charge of the rest of the court, excluding the key as well as their own sideline and the half line. When you start the game with a jump ball, one referee will obviously be doing the jump ball with the 2 opposing players, but the other referee will be standing in line with half court off the sideline towards the scorekeeper. scorekeepers. There's two reasons for this. The first is that the referee will want to make sure that the scorekeepers are setting up the possession arrow after the jump ball. And two, that referee is going to become the lead referee as soon as the jump ball happens. So once the jump ball happens and a team takes possession, the lead referee will now move towards the opposite end of the court, towards the end line, as that team makes their way towards the basket. The last thing I want to talk about is free throws. You'll need to make sure that players are lining up appropriately for the free throws. So the shooter will take their place at the free throw line. Easy enough. And then there will be a defensive player on each side of the key closest to the basket. Then next to them, moving towards the shooter, there will be an offensive player. And then on one side of the key, there will be another defensive player. That defensive player is for the shooter. So it will look uneven when players are set up correctly. Then the other four players, the two offensive and the two defensive players, will be outside the three-point arc. Once the official bounces the ball to the shooter, nobody is able to move until the ball hits the rim. While this information is not meant to be comprehensive, it should help you feel more comfortable as you go in to referee your first game. As always, dress the part and be clear and confident in your calls. And for more officiating videos, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel.